welcome. In a time-honoured tradition of online webinars, we'll just give it a minute or so to allow as many people as we can to access and to log on. So just bear with us for a short period and then we'll be right with you. So hopefully everyone's having a good day so far. Got a certainly a very interesting session ahead of us. It's always good to be able to talk about a bit of new law and make sure that everyone's aware of what's coming into force in the not so distant future at all, really. So I'm hoping we'll get a good debate and we'll get some good discussion going as well after perhaps we've taken you through the main principles that are involved. As I say, I'll just give it a little bit longer and then we can start the event. Fantastic. I always feel like I should have some elevator music playing in the background at this stage. Normally I would, I could be tempted to tell an employment law joke, but there aren't many of those, and I fear I would exhaust my supply of those relatively quickly. So thank you everyone for bearing with us. Whilst we just let the last few people in, we will just let it tick over to maybe a couple of minutes past 11, and then I will start and we can let people in. There we go. So rather than keep anyone waiting any longer, welcome to the March webinar from the employment team at Harrington Carmichael. I'm Matt Jenkin, I'm a partner in the team. I'm delighted to be joined today by my co-host and colleague, Jo Boxall. She's a solicitor in the employment team. And in this month's webinar, we're going to be looking at new legislation in respect of neonatal care leave and pay. So this is a brand new piece of employment legislation and an employment right that we need to just make sure we understand. Before we get into the heart of the session, just some housekeeping. Timing, we are due, sessions due to last for an hour. We are going to try and make sure we build in time for questions within that hour at the end. If you do want to ask a question, please do use the chat function as we go through, and we'll try and pick up as many of those as we go through. Secondly, and I know this is a question that everyone often asks, is yes, we will be sending a copy of the slides out afterwards, as well as a link to the recording. So if for some reason you're not able to stay with us for the entire session, you will get the opportunity to catch up in your own time. But that will follow, and it may take us a day or so to get that over to you, because we've just got to do some editing and get that up on our YouTube channel. So with the housekeeping out the way, let's have a look at where we're going to start with this session. Jo, if you can just move on to the what are we looking at today slide, that'd be great. So a number of things that we want to cover in today's session. I always think it's useful when you're looking at a new piece of legislation to think about the background. Why now for neonatal care leave and pay? And then Jo is going to do really the heavy lifting on this session, looking at the practicalities, the amount, timing, notice and pay that are all involved in this new right. And I've got to say at the outset, I do think this is a very complex piece of legislation for perhaps what should be a relatively straightforward protection that they're putting in place. It has, to me, shades of shared parental leave and pay, which I think for those of you who've ever tried to navigate your way through that will know it's complicated, and I think actively puts employees off from taking up that right. And when you look at the complexities of neonatal care leave and pay, I think you'll find some of those perhaps worries as well. After Jo's taken us through the practicalities, we'll then look at what protections are in place for employees who take this leave. Importantly, what can employers do to prepare? And then just a roundup of some other family-friendly changes that are on the way. As I say, we'll leave some time for questions at the end, and I'm sure there will be some once we've been through some of the intricacies of this new right. So in terms of background, we're talking here about neonatal care Leave and Pay Act 2023. Interestingly, it was originally a private member's bill, but was supported by the then Conservative government. And with the change in government, the new Labour government is happy for this also to pass into legislation, which isn't a surprise, given its direction of travel in terms of employment rights. It's in force from the 6th of April 2025, so literally round the corner. And that means that the right will apply in respect of children born on or after the 6th of April 2025. So it's not a retrospective right in that sense. Now, until that point, until we hit the 6th of April, there is no dedicated statutory right to neonatal care leave and pay in the workforce. And I think the question I've been asking, and certainly I've been asked, is it needed? My experience is that employers have adopted an informal and supportive approach to date. Simply anecdotally, it's not an area that I've been asked to advise on in my kind of practicing history that I can recall. And my overall experience is that employers tend to be very supportive of employees who find themselves in this situation. But clearly that's not everyone's experience. And at least by having a set of statutory rules in place, it'll ensure there's a consistent standard that, of course, employers who are already taking positive steps may choose to go beyond this anyway and provide additional benefits. And we'll see where perhaps some of that may be able to take place. And certainly, if you look at some of the work that Bliss, which is a charity for babies born prematurely or sick, have done, they've identified what they think are some of the key issues caused to fathers, mothers and babies around the lack of a statutory right to neonatal care leave and pay. Primarily, it's financial constraints. Mothers, fathers not being able to take time off to be with their child at a time when perhaps that support is more important than ever. And that financial constraint is all the more brought into focus because in some of the Bliss research, they said that you should factor in an additional average cost of £405 per week throughout a baby's neonatal stay for their parents. So at already time when finances are subject to constraint, that additional cost perhaps is an added barrier to taking up neonatal care leave and pay where there's no right to be paid at this current stage. And it does have an impact. Parents struggle to be involved in the baby's care. That has a negative impact for both the mother and their partner on their mental health and their relationships. Mums returning to work before they're ready. And also the research has shown that actually having parents deliver hands-on care, even in a neonatal care situation, produces better health outcomes for the baby. So there's a whole host of reasons as to why it's going to be helpful. But if we look at the numbers that we think will be impacted by this, I think it is quite interesting because even on the government's own impact assessment for this legislation, they say about 60,000 parents will be eligible each year for this new statutory right. And out of that, there'll be a take-up of £34,000, 34,000 individuals. And actually, that's relatively a small proportion of the workforce, isn't it? So if you're looking at this as an organisation, hopefully it's not something that you'll be having to consider as a kind of daily occurrence. And that might factor in, mightn't it, as to where you spend your time in terms of supporting and training around this. So I think that's going to be an important aspect to look at. So having kind of given you that background, I'm now going to hand over to Joe, who, as I say, is going to really take you through the nuts and bolts of what I say is a complicated piece of legislation. And yeah, I think it's something you're going to have to get used to those complexities. So Joe, over to you.
So you've had your health warning. This is complicated. So what I'm trying to do is break it down so we can understand each individual part. I'm going to start with what it is so we can get an idea of what it's going to be looking like. I've broken up the days into sort of arrow sections, and as I go through this slide, I'll explain how that works in terms of that neonatal care. So the neonatal care must be medical or care that is outside of a hospital facility following discharge under the direction of a consultant, or in unfortunate cases, palliative care. The whole idea of this leave is that it is taken in addition to other leave, as Matt already said at the beginning. So mothers and fathers typically have maternity and paternity leave and pay. This is more sort of to be tagged onto the end of it in these extenuating circumstances where there is, neonatal care. It's more helpful than existing leave that's already in place. So we know about statutory parental leave, but the employee in that instance needs to give at least 21 days notice, and the employer can defer the leave for 6 months for business related reasons if it wanted to. So it's meant to give that a little bit more flexibility by introducing this new right. So that neonatal care, so the medical care received in the hospital or elsewhere, needs to start within 28 days of the baby's life. It needs to last for at least 7 full and consecutive days, not including that first day. And it needs to be over sort of a 68-week period. So a parent can take up to 12 weeks neonatal leave in a 68-week period. But again, that baby needs to be receiving the neonatal care within the first 28 days. Complicated. So I've tried to put, like I said, put it out on the arrows here. We accrue it in weeks, this leave. So it has to be, like I said, 7 consecutive days, not including the first day, in order to qualify for 1 week's leave. And it sort of works in blocks, which we'll be going on to. So who's eligible for this new right? So we've done the what, now we're doing the who. So it applies to employees only in Great Britain, not Northern Ireland. It's a day 1 right to the leave, not the pay, which we'll go on to. And it's available to both the parents. It is not eligible for sort of relatives, so grandparents, that sort of person. It is meant to be somebody who has a parental responsibility for that child. So they have that actual parental or personal relationship, and there needs to be an expectation that that individual will have responsibility for raising the child. So we can include birth parents, their partners, surrogates, adoption, all of those sort of people are included. Now we move on to the types of the neonatal care leave. And again, this is not an easy subject. So this is the leave that can be taken within those 68 weeks from the day the baby is born. So we have tier 1 leave. So that's intended for emergency situations where the baby is still receiving care, or up to 1 week post-discharge. It cannot be taken in that waiting period. So during that first week, the parent will obviously be on maternity or paternity leave, and then they start to accrue that week's block of leave. With tier 1 leave, it can be taken in non-consecutive week blocks, which is how it differs to tier 2 leave that we'll be going on to. It's unlimited as well. So you can take as much sort of intermittent time as you want to. It can be stopped to accommodate other pre-booked leave, so paternity, shared parental, but it cannot stop maternity or adoption because we can't curtail those. Any remaining leave must be taken immediately at the end of the pre-booked leave, so we need that continuity in that week. Then we go on to tier 2 leave. So that's designed for all other leave and essentially tags onto the end of other family leave, such as parental leave or maternity. Maternity is probably the most likely to use the tier 2 leave because we know we have a continuous period that can't be curtailed for maternity, whereas tier 1 might be more for paternity leave for the fathers or for the partner of the parent. The difference with tier 2, and the main difference that is that it cannot be taken in non-consecutive week blocks. It has to be taken continuously. So I've tried to demonstrate that with the bars, which are meant to show the weeks. So we cannot interrupt tier 2, but we can interrupt tier 1. Notice. So understandably, this is quite a stressful time for parents. The last thing you're thinking about when your baby is in neonatal care is how I'm going to tell my employer and what I need to tell them. So for tier 1, those emergency circumstances, you inform the employer as soon as reasonably practicable. If you want to receive pay, which again we'll move on to later on the slides, then there will need to be some written notice that needs to be given within 28 days. And we can safely assume most employees will want to receive that pay. It works slightly differently for tier 2 because we're tagging that onto the end of pre-existing leave, such as maternity. So if you want to take that 1 week block, which is your continuous block, you have to give 15 days notice. And if you want to take 2 or more weeks consecutive leave, you need to give 28 days notice. If the baby is discharged from neonatal care, but the neonatal care starts again within the first 28 days after the baby's birth for a further qualifying week or more, the tier 1 period resumes until 7 days after that neonatal care ends. So this is what the notice sort of looks like. I've tried to break it down so it is nice and clear what we need to be giving to the employer. So parents need to be including their name, the child's date of birth, if there's an adoption, the date of the baby's placement or arrival, the start date of neonatal leave, end date if that is known, and if we have circumstances where the baby leaves neonatal care and then enters into it again, those dates are included too. The number of weeks already taken or intended to be taken, and then the declaration. So like I said, this applies to employees only, and they need to have a parental relationship with that child. And there is an expectation that they will be caring for that child during that leave. Whilst we get this notice, it should be limited to as much as we need to know. It's a very sensitive time for parents. We don't necessarily need to know why that baby is receiving that neonatal care, and it should be treated very sensitively. There are different requirements for tier 1 leave and tier 2 leave, so it gets a bit more complicated. What we suggest is using the same blanket written notice for both tier 1 and tier 2. Therefore, you have all of the information you need, and it can just be easily and consistently applied from each employee. With the leave, like I said, you don't need to notify in writing if you're taking tier 1. You can waive those notice requirements. It's only the pay that we have to give that written notice. So the written notice for pay looks very similar to the leave, except after we've had the declaration point, we need to confirm the following information. So we've got a day 1 right to leave, but not to pay. The pay, you need to be continuously employed for 26 weeks at the end of the 15th week before the expected week of childbirth. So it looks very similar to maternity. Average weekly earnings in that 8-week period ending with the relevant week before the expected week of childbirth need to be no less than the lower earnings limit. In 2025 to 2026, that will be £125. So we need to add these on. I recommend that you tag them on to your written notice anyway, because we can anticipate the employee will be asking for leave and pay. Like I said, for pay, cannot waive this written notice. So what does the pay actually look like? You need to have that 26 weeks continuous service, like I said, i.e. 6 months, earn more than the lower earnings threshold of £125 a week, and the statutory rate will be £187.18p, which is the same as maternity. It will be that amount, or 90% of earnings, whatever's less. Recovery for employers also mirrors the other leave entitlements that we have. So employers can recover 92% or 100% plus 8.5% for the year 2025 to 2026 for small employers. Where there is pay entitlement for other child-related leave, such as maternity or paternity, the relevant week for the neonatal care pay aligns with that other entitlement. So your software should be able to match up to accommodate this. Employers are open to consider whether they want to give enhanced pay as well. So many of you might use enhanced pay for maternity and or paternity or shared parental. You might want to think about consistency in those policies and giving an enhancement if you would like to. You could also say that it's a day 1 right to pay rather than having to wait those 26 continuous weeks, but that is entirely up to each employer and how likely they feel this is actually going to be used. So what happens if we want to then cancel tier 2 neonatal care leave? So this is the leave that we use at the end of a block where we've already taken as much as we can. So maternity leave where it can't be curtailed. This is where we would want to potentially cancel it. The statutory position is that you have to give the amount of notice you want to take in response. So it sort of is, it works together that way. It's the same notice back. So if you want to take 1 week, you have to give 15 days notice. And if you want to take 2 or more consecutive weeks, give 28 days notice. There is an opportunity for an employer to apply some discretion as well. So the employer might decide to give 1 week's notice or perhaps shorter if that's agreed with their manager. But because of the structure of neonatal care leave, an employee cannot return partway through a week. It has to be those consecutive week blocks, and we can't depart from that. Tier 1 leave, we cannot change the provisions there for cancelling that because, like I said, it's intended to be that emergency leave where the baby is still receiving care. So there's not really any provision for that within the statute. Matt, I'm now handing back over to you to go on to the protection for employees.
Thanks, Jo. And as we said right from the outset, that is an incredibly complex piece of legislation for what is a relatively simple kind of, or should be a relatively simple right to provide. As I understand it, the basic idea of neonatal care leave is that it'll be tagged on to the end of an employee's family leave, because an employee whose baby is admitted for neonatal care is highly likely to be on some other family leave at the time.
Exactly that.
Typically maternity or paternity leave.
Mm-hmm.
I think the idea is that they'd then be able to take the neonatal care leave at the end of their planned family leave. Mm-hmm. So they're kind of compensated for the time their baby spent in neonatal care. Is that right?
That's the idea. So we want to prevent an employee having to use that existing leave entitlement for neonatal care. We want to tag it on or make it flexible in the tier 1 sort of leave period so that employees don't miss out on that family leave that they already had pre-booked.
But then as well as that more kind of, I suppose that's the planned neonatal care, but they've also had to try and I think, as I understand it, cater for emergency situations when of course perhaps an employee isn't already on leave whilst the baby's in neonatal care. Mm-hmm. And that could be because, say, paternity leaves run out. So I think that's, am I right? And that's really why we've got kind of tier 1 and tier 2 for those kind of planned and emergency aspects, which I do think makes it overly complicated in terms of the legislation. So, but thank you for taking us through that, Jo. I think that's hopefully helpful for people, if only to emphasize how complex this is. As Jo said, there's protection for employees in place who take up neonatal care leave. And it's very similar to other family-friendly statutory rights like maternity protections and paternity protections. So during that NCL, the neonatal care leave period, employees are entitled to benefit of all terms and conditions other than pay, which of course is dealt with separately, which would have applied had they not been on neonatal care leave. So for example, they'll continue to accrue their holiday entitlement during that neonatal care leave. On their return from NCL, in most cases, they're going to be entitled to return to the same job at the end of that neonatal care leave period. So you'll have to factor that into your planning. They're also, as you would expect, protected from detriment. So you couldn't, for example, start taking shifts away from someone because they'd taken neonatal care leave. That would amount to a detriment. And interestingly, there's no qualification period necessary for that detriment claim. There's automatic unfair dismissal, again, very similar to other family-friendly rights here. If someone was dismissed because they'd taken leave or because you thought they were about to take leave, then that would be an automatic unfair dismissal and no qualifying service. There's also some additional protections in terms of a redundancy. So if an employee is being made redundant during or after NCL or during an additional protected period, they would be entitled to be offered a suitable alternative vacancy. And I think that's a priority. That would be a priority right over other employees, although you could have different competing priority rights in those circumstances, such as a priority right for those returning from maternity leave. So very interesting to see how that's going to be factored into the protections that are in place. But clearly, if you're going to give employees this new right, the government is very keen that those employees will have protections in terms of taking up those new rights. So as ever, we look then, don't we, as to, well, what do employers need to do in terms of preparing for this new right? And we've sketched out here some of the things that we've been looking at with some of our clients and considering. First of all, I think you will have to look at introducing a policy. I'm sure many of you out there will have a suite of family-friendly maternity leave, family-friendly policies such as maternity leave, paternity leave, shared parental leave and pay. All of those things I'm sure you have in place. If you do, then I think it would make sense to have a neonatal care leave and pay policy to sit alongside that, reflecting the language that you use in your current policies. As I'm sure you'll have highlighted here, that it's complex. And I think the policy itself will be complex because it needs to reflect the statutory rights that are in place. But certainly I think both employers and employees will find it helpful to have a policy in place because it will guide employers and employees alike through some of the statutory complexities. Secondly, I think you need to think about updating handbooks and other terms of employment, such as contracts of employment, for example. Many of you may have, for example, recently revised your contracts of employment in light of the changes to the working time regulations and the carryover of holiday, and have provided in your contracts that holiday will continue to accrue during periods of maternity leave, paternity leave, shared parental leave and pay. Whereas now I think you're going to need to update that to make it clear that they will continue to accrue during any periods of neonatal care leave. Another example where you may want to adapt your policies and contracts to reflect those new arrangements. So I think it's going to really a health check for your other contractual terms to make sure you're properly reflecting this new statutory right. Training to managers and HR. I think this is an interesting one because I do think managers and HR need to be aware of these new changes. I would just question, where training budgets are strained at this current time, is this a sensible place to spend a lot of training? And I think you just have to be cautious on that. Again, let's go back to how many employees may be impacted by this, around about 34,000. And so whilst I think some general training and updates would be helpful, I think more targeted and specific training may be a step too far for what may be an underused piece of legislation in the end. One of the areas, and it's something Joe and I have talked about, is employers who want to do more than just this bare minimum statutory leave. And where are we seeing employers thinking about making some of those changes? Certainly, I think around about considering enhanced pay. At the moment, it's a relatively low level of pay. So you might find employers who are being more generous and are paying full pay for the full period of 12 weeks, or perhaps full pay for a significant proportion of that. And I think that's where employers will perhaps look to use this as a differential as part of their recruitment and retention piece to demonstrate that they take these things seriously as an employer and go beyond the mere statutory rights that are in place. They could also consider longer leave. I'm not so sure that employers will rush to do that. So I think where we're certainly seeing our advice at the moment, when we're helping clients draft policies, the discussion certainly in my experience, tends to be around the amount of pay rather than the amount of leave. I'm seeing the leave staying at the current statutory rate for sure. Think about your payroll systems to accommodate neonatal care pay. I'm not going to sit here and say I'm a payroll expert, but we just need to make sure that the payroll systems can accommodate it so you can properly account for it and pay it when it's due in the correct amounts. I know some employers will have to look at implementing systems for tracking employees who are on neonatal care leave to reflect the fact they're entitled to this enhanced redundancy protection. So if you're going through a redundancy protection, a redundancy consultation exercise, that would still include those employees who are on neonatal care leave, but because they've got this additional right to be offered suitable alternative employment, you just have to be careful that you are factoring them into the equation as well. Certainly, I think the next stage is communicating changes to managers and employees. So, and I think this largely will be on the back of the policy that's introduced, making your employees aware of this new policy and new right. I think because it is complicated, you might want to think of a briefing note that can go alongside the policy that kind of summarizes the key issues. Hopefully, it's not something employees need to call on, but I think as an organisation, the way in which we communicate that can help. So be very clear, perhaps on a summary of what the rights are to sit alongside the policy. And again, that's something I know that we can work with clients on to produce. And also consider data privacy. In my experience, this can sometimes be lost a little bit in the discussion around support for employees who've got babies in neonatal care. You need to respect the employee's wishes in relation to sharing information with colleagues as to the reason for absence. I know in lots of organisations we love to share good news and updates around births and children and babies and things like that. I think you just have to be careful that this is sensitive personal data, and you need to think carefully about that. I think the difficulty is the opportunities to have those discussions with employees is going to be limited, isn't it? Because frankly, they'll have more important things to worry about than talking to their employer about who they should share their personal data with. So I think until you've had that conversation with an employee, you should err on the side of caution and make sure that you're not sharing sensitive health data with colleagues until you know you've got the green light to do that. So I think there's some sensible steps that employers can look to take for sure. In relation to this, I think the building block for the start of that is definitely the policy. So in terms of other things that I think employers need to think about, there's other family-friendly changes that are on the horizon as well, largely driven, of course, by the Employment Rights Bill. Some of you may have heard or speak about this before. Our next April webinar is the kind of the super April webinar, which we often do, which will be our employment law update, which is likely to be heavily focused around the impact of the Employment Rights Bill. I've been advising on employment law for nearly 30 years now, and this is a seismic shift in employment law. I can't remember a bigger time. And while some of the other things like the removal of the qualifying period for unfair dismissal has certainly attracted the headlines from the Employment Rights Bill, there's other important family-friendly changes as well. So, for example, we're going to see some day one rights for paternity leave, no longer a 26-week service. We'll also see parental leave becoming a day one right instead of what I think is the current 1 year qualification period. We're likely to see bereavement leave introduced. The mood music from Parliament at the moment suggests that bereavement leave will be unpaid, but nonetheless will be a statutory right. What I think was interesting around bereavement leave is we're waiting on regulations around the relationships that an individual has to have with a deceased to qualify. And Joe talked about the parental relationships that you have in place, perhaps to benefit from neonatal care leave and pay. You may see a similar approach and a similar definitions used for bereavement leave. We are going to see the potential extending of redundancy protection for pregnant women and new parents. At the moment, I've talked about this limited positive duty, which only is really to offer alternative employment during pregnancy, maternity leave, or extended period after maternity leave. At the moment, employees who are pregnant or new parents who are taking up other family-friendly leave don't have a right not to be dismissed. They're not ring-fenced, for example, from a redundancy process. What they're looking here at is introducing powers to ban dismissals for anyone who is pregnant, on maternity leave, or during a 6-month return period, except in specific circumstances. And they haven't defined what those specific circumstances will be. So I do think that we are starting to see the extension of those protections. I'd like to think that those specified circumstances, for example, would include a redundancy situation. I think it's difficult to see why an employee, simply for the fact that they are on maternity leave, for example, would be ring-fenced from redundancy if other colleagues are losing jobs at the same time. But it's certainly one to wait and see, and we're seeing that extension of those rights coming through. Also, just a reminder, statutory maternity pay and other statutory pay increases in April. That goes up to £187.18 per week, which again will be the rate that applies to neonatal care leave and pay. So lots heading on the horizon, on the back of, as I say, what is a complex piece of legislation. I hope you found that useful, and I can see already, Joe, that we've had some questions through which look really interesting. So the first one we've had, Joe, is, does neonatal leave start before maternity starts?
No. So maternity will start in an ordinary way, so either pre-booked or as soon as the baby is born. So the idea is it's meant to tag on to the end. We have to have that 1 week continuous block accrued first before we can take that neonatal leave. So it's an accrual and then a back date, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so the baby would have to be born first to start that qualifying period running, and then the neonatal care leave follows from that, as I understand it.
Yes.
Okay. Someone else has asked just us to confirm how many weeks of neonatal care leave apply. I think, Joe, am I right in saying that's 12?
You are, yes. I can whiz back to, it's quite confusing, the amount of days and how it works. So I'll whiz back,
to revisit that. I think that'd be helpful because, it certainly took us as an employment law team a couple of goes, sat in a kind of dark room with a cold towel on our heads, trying to work out exactly how some of this legislation applied. So I'm not surprised that there's questions around this. So it's really good just to revisit that, Joe, if we can in the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we can just sort of summarise the care. So it has to be medical care received in a hospital or somewhere outside the hospital under the direction of a consultant, or palliative care. Say if the baby is moved from one place to another, so it goes from one hospital to another, that doesn't interrupt the period of care, so it is still continuous. Like the care itself must be for at least 7 continuous days, not including the day it started. So if we take the 1st of April, it wouldn't start until the 2nd of April, and then it would be 7 days from then. That care has to start within the first 28 days of the baby's life, and that's the first time. So obviously, baby might be readmitted to hospital during, with complications, that sort of thing. But to qualify for neonatal care leave and pay, that care has to start within those 28 days. As we've already covered, parents can take up to 12 weeks, whether that's in the Tier 1 non-continuous blocks or in the Tier 2. All leave, however, has to be taken within 68 weeks of the baby's birth.
Excellent. Thank you for that clarification, Joe. I think that's useful just to revisit some of those key timetables, isn't it? The 7 days, the 28 days, the 12 weeks, and then finally the 68-week kind of long stop date. So thank you for taking us through that again. We've had a question around are we going to send a copy of the recording? Yes, we're going to send that out in the slides. And if people have any follow-up questions they want to ask around that, once they've had an opportunity to reflect on this new right, then please do use that as an opportunity to feedback that to us as well. Got another question here, Jo. So if full maternity leave is taken, we would start neonatal care leave thereafter and start paying again, which I think is right, isn't it? They would potentially, you could exhaust your maternity leave and then have a further period of neonatal care leave on the back of the maternity leave ending, and you would get neonatal care leave pay.
That's essentially what the tier 2 leave is designed for. So we can tag it on to the end of maternity once pay is exhausted, and it's paid at that statutory rate of £187.
Yeah, I think it's a really good way you've described it there, Jo, kind of tagging it on to it. It's seen as to be added on at the end rather than during. We've got a really interesting question here. Will fathers, for example, be given enhanced redundancy protection, not just those on maternity, adoption leave? If so, for how long? For those on maternity leave, is the 12 weeks added onto the 18 months protection? I don't think it would be added onto the 18 months protection. I think it'll be 18 months protection in total, to answer the second question first. And I do think that fathers will be given that enhanced redundancy protection. Interestingly, they are also, as part of the Employment Rights Bill, conducting an overall review of family-friendly leave in all its constituent parts. So whether or not we're going to see a root and branch reform of family-friendly leave at some stage is to wait and see. But I think there's a view that perhaps it's not working as well as it can be. I've mentioned shared parental leave, and I can't remember the last time a client asked me about shared parental leave and pay, whereas I typically will get lots of questions around maternity leave and paternity leave. So I think there will be a review as to how this is working, but I'd expect these protections to apply to effectively anyone who's taking a period of statutory family-friendly leave, not just maternity. Is that your view as well, Jo?
Yes.
Okay. And we've had another good question here. So do they have to go on maternity leave for 1 week and then the following weeks they can do neonatal care leave?
It's better to think of paternity, because we can take 2 weeks paternity, and that doesn't have to be in that 2 week continuous block anymore. It can be, intermittent. So the idea is you would start that leave first, and then whilst baby is in neonatal care, accruing that 7 days, it then gets tagged on to the end of that period.
Yeah, I guess technically someone could go on maternity leave for 1 week, come back and then go on neonatal care leave, but there'd be little benefit to do that. Apart from perhaps, the only reason why perhaps someone would return early from maternity leave would be so that they can use a period of neonatal care leave instead of unpaid maternity leave. But I think that would be further down the line, perhaps. Also had a question, Jo. Do employers need to ask for proof like they do with maternity, so that the MAC B1 form that employees have to provide? I know they have to give a notice, but is there any proof of neonatal care that needs to be provided?
I'd have to check, but I don't believe so. I think all that is required under the statute is that written notice for the pay.
That's my understanding as well. I think I try not to use the phrase a light touch with regard to notification, because I think certainly the notices are anything other than a light touch, but certainly in terms of medical evidence to support the fact that people are on neonatal care leave, I don't see that as part of the regulations, and anything I've read that needs to be provided. And again, my experience is that I'm not advising on employees abusing things like this anyway. So as long as they fill in the notice, you're not going to necessarily be able to go behind that and ask for the medical evidence. Someone said, assume the number of weeks leave should correlate to the number of weeks baby is in neonatal care. So
if I'm interpreting that question correctly, it's 7 days is 1 week.
Yeah.
So you have to accrue that first,
Yeah.
And then if you want to take it in non-continuous sort of blocks, that's the
Yeah.
tier 1 leave. If you want a great long chunk, that's
Yeah.
the tier 2.
But it should correlate to the period of neonatal care. It's designed to support employees in neonatal care. So
yes.
Okay. I hope that answers the question. If not, and that's still a confusing point, we can look at that again. Also had a question: babies receive care in the first 7 days sometimes, but may not be born early. Do they still qualify?
It has to be that first 28 days.
Yeah, but I think, but it wouldn't necessarily mean that we're talking about say a premature baby. I think if your baby's born and they require neonatal care of any description, then you still qualify for the leave.
Yes.
Okay. Someone's asked this is some really great technical stuff here, Joe. I'm glad you've read the regulations in detail. Could an employee have tier 1 and tier 2 if their circumstances played out that way?
I haven't. Obviously, this is a new right. I don't think there's anything preventing an employee from using tier 1 and tier 2. But it really depends on the circumstances. Say you employ the mother who's on maternity, she can't curtail her maternity leave. So she can't decide to suddenly stop and then restart maternity. So it's most likely she's going to be using that tier 2. You could think maybe with paternity leave, which is more likely to be used in the tier 1 period, potentially they could maybe use tier 2. But again, it's a very high level question that I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, so I suppose in theory, you have an employee who takes that emergency tier 1 leave and then has to take some more kind of planned neonatal care leave at a later date.
Yeah.
I think it's one of those, technically it's possible. I'm not sure how much it would happen in practice.
No, especially as you only got 12 weeks that you can take.
Yes, I agree. Someone's made a great point here. Wouldn't birth parents still have to do their compulsory 2 weeks maternity leave before moving on to neonatal or other parental leave? I think that's right. You've got that compulsory 2 weeks, which you can't curtail. So you're not going to be able, even if you wanted to, you couldn't end your maternity leave period earlier and go on to neonatal care leave. We had a great question. Any kind of provisions for multiple births? If you have twins and they're both in hospital for 4 weeks, can the parents get 8 weeks neonatal care leave instead of just 4?
Short answer, no. We've discussed that. So it applies to both the babies. Unfortunately, we can't double up.
Yeah, and this, as I say, this is where you start. And I think these questions have been really illustrative, Joe, of how what should be, we think, a straightforward piece of legislation already. People have asked some really great and insightful questions, I think, about how does this work in practice. And if we're asking the questions at this level, and you've got two employment lawyers who are saying, well, this is our understanding of it. I'm not sure how employees will navigate their way through, so definitely one to watch out for.
It's why we recommend that policy, particularly with the notice requirements, to ensure consistency. So trying to make it as easy as possible for the employee and the employer. The last thing they're going to be thinking about in these sorts of circumstances is, oh, what do I need to do? So if we can make it as easy as possible, that's helpful for everybody.
For sure. And I think that goes back to the point that I know we've discussed and I made at the beginning, which is our experiences and acting across a variety of sectors and for a number of employers, is that they are genuinely supportive of their employees who are going through a very difficult time with neonatal care leave. I think this legislation is a useful framework for that, and I think a policy will help. And I think that should be where employers are looking at in the first instance, to sit alongside the current suite of family-friendly policies that they have in place. Not only because I think it shows you that they understand the law, but I think it'll help employees and employers and HR teams, etc., navigate their way through a complex area. But I know from the policies that I've drafted, just because of the way in which the statutory regime applies, it takes a little bit of working through. I don't think you could easily adapt, for example, a maternity policy to cover a neonatal care leave policy. I think it needs to be a standalone policy that is included in your normal suite.
I agree with that.
Excellent. Well, I can't see that we've had any more questions come through. I'm really grateful for everyone who's joined us today. Hopefully you found that insightful. Thank you so much for asking those great questions. Hopefully we've managed to answer those. If not, you've still got queries. There's mine and Joe's contact details. Always happy to discuss all things employment law. You can follow us on LinkedIn. And yeah, as I say, recording and session to follow. Just leaves me to say, hope you have a great rest of the day. And thank you, Joe, for such a great contribution to that session. You really did do the heavy lifting on the complexities around this. So a big thank you from me as well, because certainly it helped clarify a lot of points for me as well. So as I say, have a great rest of the day, and hopefully we see you at our April session. Thank you.